Advice at its best is one person's limited perspective of the infinite possibilities before you. People's advice is based on their fears, their experiences, their prejudices, and at the end of the day, their advice is just that. It's theirs, not yours. You are the first time you've ever happened. You and now are a unique occurrence of which you are the most reliable measure of all the possibilities. This was a quote taken from the 2021 New York Times bestseller, Will, the story of Will Smith's life in the words of the Fresh Prince himself. Now, growing up, I was a huge Will Smith fan. I loved Men in Black. I used to think Getting Jiggy With It was the coolest song ever. And I loved Will Smith so much, my dad would make Philly cheesesteaks for dinner. And shout out to my dad for making Philly cheesesteaks like the Fresh Prince and also literal green eggs and hams. So all that said, the past few years have been a bit painful for me, realizing that a childhood hero was actually a very talented but misguided person. Even before the controversial slap at the Oscars, Will's life was full of personal missteps, none bigger than his decision in 2013 to start an open marriage with his wife, and, well, it did not go well. And I couldn't help but to think about Will's quote in 2021. I mean, it sounds great and inspirational at first, this idea that you are unique, you are the most reliable measure of the possibilities, and it sounds really credible too, coming from a guy who was a millionaire at 19 years old and whose net worth is now $350 million. Except this isn't good advice because Jeremiah tells us something completely different. He says that you and I are the least reliable measure of all the possibilities because the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Trusting our own intuition, trusting ourselves 100% of the time leads to disastrous ends, and Jeremiah would have known this all too well considering the fact he grew up in an area, a kingdom that existed because of one man's failure to listen to advice. Rehoboam had the unenviable task of replacing his father, King Solomon. This is like having to follow up Simone Biles or Michael Jordan. You are following up the GOAT. And Solomon, just to remind you, was the guy that God gave wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. There was nobody like Solomon, and at the end of his reign, the kingdom was bigger and better than it had ever been. To illustrate this, just take a look at this map we're going to throw on the screen. The red is what King Saul ruled. The orange and red is what David ruled, and Solomon expanded the kingdom even more into the yellow areas up north. All this territory was the legacy and responsibility Rehoboam inherited. If you're feeling stressed for this guy, then you are understanding the pressure he was under. But Rehoboam had two things working in his favor. The first one was that he was the son of Solomon. For 41 years, he got to watch his dad rule, and he had the privilege of learning directly from the guy who was responsible for the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and 7 quintillion other topics he happened to be an expert in. If your parent wrote 2 books in the Bible, I think you got a solid foundation to work with. And secondly, Solomon didn't leave Rehoboam hanging, but left behind an intact kingdom and a group of solid advisors to help him transition into the role. Now, on the one hand, Solomon demonstrates for us the importance of setting up the next generation for success. Often leaders, out of insecurity, focus so much on their need to feel valuable, loved, and desired that they don't give enough attention to replacing themselves. And Solomon was wise enough to know that the best leaders are the ones who raise up others to do what they do, only to do it better. But on the other hand, Solomon also serves as a cautionary tale that the decisions we make today can have generational consequences tomorrow. Solomon, as you might remember, burdened the Israelites with forced labor for 20 years. And by the time Rehoboam became king, well, the people had had enough. And so they gathered together and they send a representative by the name of Jeroboam to Rehoboam to plead their case. And by the way, this is some fantastic writing here in Hebrew because Jeroboam means to represent the people. And he is literally asking the king on behalf of the people to reconsider the amount of labor. And meanwhile, Rehoboam means to enlarge the people, which is the task that Rehoboam has inherited from his dad Solomon and wants to get done. And both names, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, just happen to rhyme as well. Anyways, that's enough fun with Hebrew. Here's what goes down. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all of Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days, and then come back to me." So the people and Jeroboam went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. And they replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." At first, Rehoboam shows that the apple doesn't fall too far from the wisdom tree. He understands how big the task of ruling is, that the weight of his father and grandfather's legacy rested on his shoulders, and that the first decision he needs to make as ruler is too important to rush. So, he wisely tells Jeroboam and the crew to give him a couple days to think about it. And then Rehoboam does another wise thing. He gathers his dad's advisors together in one room and asks them to help him make the right decision. The elders tell Rehoboam, "Serve the people, and they will serve you." So Rehoboam listens to them and ends slavery in the kingdom. He reigns for another 40 years and expands his father's kingdom even further. And to this day in Israel, they say, "None shall ever be like Rehoboam, who exceeded even Solomon in prudence and wisdom." Well, at least that's how the story should have ended. But that's not how the story ends at all. Rehoboam did the right thing. He took time to think about his decisions. He consulted the best people to coach him on ruling. But for some reason, he doesn't take their advice. Instead, he decides to also check in with his friends, and it does not go well. We can return back to the text and read here. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. And he asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" And the young men who had grown up with Rehoboam replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now you tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins.'" And yes, pause here, that's in the Bible. And side note, probably not the best thing to say to a group of disgruntled people or in any public setting, but moving forward. "My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, but I will scourge you with scorpions." Now the elders coach Rehoboam to compromise, to show empathy, and to serve the people. His friends, however, tell him to make a dirty joke, to play tough, and to lay the hammer down. And Rehoboam just so tragically sides with his friends, thinking that their advice will help him to live up to his name and legacy and gain respect from the people. And to no one's surprise, it has the opposite effect, because all the people respond in this way. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So Israel went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the town of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. So what happens is that 10 out of the 12 tribes in Israel reject Rehoboam as king and install Jeroboam as their new ruler. The 10 plus Jeroboam become the northern kingdom of Israel, and what is left under Rehoboam's rule becomes the southern kingdom of Judah. And so instead of gaining respect, Rehoboam's decision caused 83% of the population to leave him for good. And he lost more than 50% of the territory that Solomon held. And worst of all, the northern and southern kingdom never reunited again, and all this happens because Rehoboam took the wrong kind of advice to heart. Here's a couple of things we can learn as we reflect on Rehoboam's story together. First, let's not miss what Rehoboam did right. He sought after advice. Perhaps Solomon's words were ringing in his head that the way of a fool seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice. Another way to put this is, we never outgrow the need to learn from others. Life is too complicated to navigate on our own. Our hearts are too twisted, as Jeremiah said, to be trusted upon solely. And this process of becoming more like Jesus and living the way he calls us to is not something we can do alone. We need other people to learn how to live life well. And we need to be willing to humble ourselves and to accept that I don't know everything that there is to know. I don't have the best answers, and so I'm going to seek them out in other people, and I'm going to seek other people to coach me and to help me. But here's the thing. Being willing to seek advice is not enough. Just as importantly, we need to consider who we are seeking advice from. There's a saying I learned in college that your closest friends can be your worst roommates. And based on Rehoboam's story, I think we can also say that our closest friends can be also our worst advisors. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have friends that offer God-honoring advice, but what I am saying is you really got to discern who those friends are. Because Rehoboam grew up with his guys. He trusted them. And at this point in the story, Rehoboam was 41, so he had spent quite a bit of time with them, but they all misled him. And I don't think our friendships are so special or so different that the same couldn't happen to us. Sometimes our friends will correct us and they will guide us well, and sometimes they will fail us. Sometimes we need to call upon those we know and those we've grown up with, but often we need to get some outside perspective. We need someone outside of our regular circle to give us the wisdom we need. And if we do seek advice from the right people and God is speaking through them, then here's the most important thing we need to remember. Sometimes godly advice will sound more like advice. Back when I was a starting center for the Graham Elementary Grizzlies, my coach used to tell me that my jump shot mechanics were awful. And it was kind of like Derek Fisher's rainbow shot just going above my head, and it wasn't working. And so he told me I need to adjust my shot. And when I started changing my shot, it was really uncomfortable, and I was missing basket after basket. And instead of averaging 6 points a game, I was averaging 2 points a game. So I told my coach, there's no way I am adjusting this. I'm going to continue to average my 6 points and 2 rebounds and 5 turnovers a game. And guess what? The coach was right, and here I am working at RBCC instead of being in the NBA. Point of the story is this. I didn't take the coach's advice because it didn't feel right to me, right? I couldn't see immediate results. I did not have the wisdom to realize how this one fix in my jump shot could have landed me in the NBA. Okay, and there's 5 other factors as well that prevented me from joining the NBA, including height and all these other things. But anyways, what I'm trying to get at is this. I missed what was best for me because it didn't seem right to me. You can be humble enough to seek advice. You can be discerning enough to find the right person to give you advice, but be foolish enough to reject it because you see it as advice. So before rejecting or accepting any advice, what we need to do is consult someone like Rehoboam, someone that Rehoboam completely forgot about. We need to ask God what to do as well. We need him to show us the difference between what is bad advice and what is uncomfortable advice. And we need to have the ears to hear, not just what we want to hear, but what God has to say to us through scripture, through prayer, and through other believers. And by the way, if you're wondering, well, what does that look like? What does that sound like? How can you tell if God is speaking to you? Well, here's some questions you can ask yourself. First of all, does it align with what God has to say in the Bible? Secondly, does taking this advice make you more or less like Jesus? Third, do other people who are walking with God affirm what you are hearing? And finally, does it serve those who are around you or does it only serve you? Now, all that said, here's the last question I want to leave you with this morning. What is your next step when it comes to taking advice? Do you need to seek advice? Do you need to discern who you are receiving advice from? Or do you need to be willing to hear and act upon advice? And if you're already doing all this, great. Then the next step for you is, do you need to be someone who is willing to mentor, disciple, and offer advice to someone else? Well, thank you for joining us online, and we will see you next week for the continuation of our Royal series. Seek advice, hear from God, and we hope to see you soon. God bless.